Computer. All right. So I just wanted to welcome everyone. And before introducing Elad, and giving him the mic, I just want to say a few words about this campaign. So as Elad will discuss in his presentation, many of the talking points of white nationalism have creeped up in the discourse of many in Orthodox synagogues throughout the United States, with right-wing pundits such as Dennis Prager and Ben Shapiro serving as primary sources of information. And combined with the pale skin color of most American Ashkenazi Jews, there have been a general othering of many of our congregations of our congregants of color. And while the reality is quite complex, as Rabbi Shais Rishon explained in our first webinar, these two elements, right, the coupling between an ideology that embraces whiteness and the lack of awareness that non-white Jews exist, has concerned us enough to address this issue through a prolonged campaign. So this campaign consists of 3 parts, which are designed to raise awareness of the issue and inspire us to help combat this ideology from both within and outside the Jewish community. So the 3 parts of the community are signing a pledge that expressing the need to call out racist behavior of people in our institutions, a resource page with many materials, which is intended to inform readers about race in America today and how it manifests itself, and an 8-part webinar series that will run over the course of this year. So this webinar series will follow a narrative arc, with the first 2 analyzing the problem in more depth, the middle 4 unpacking the complexities of race within the Jewish tradition, and the last 2 focused on potential strategies for making us better equipped to deal with the present realities at hand. So the last webinar, we heard Rabbi Shais Rishon discuss his experience as an African-American Orthodox rabbi in the American Jewish community, and he especially highlighted the subtle ways in which he was marginalized in his community, including getting his Jewishness frequently challenged and tested. And he also described how to be more aware of the racial diversity that makes up both the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic communities. So that session was recorded, and it is available on our website for those interested in watching the entire discussion. All right, so now that brings us to this session. So in this session, you'll hear from Elad Nehorai, who will describe how white nationalist ideology has infiltrated the Orthodox community, and how our 45th president, Donald Trump, has exacerbated these views over the past 4 years of his tenure. So a little bit about Elad. Elad Nehorai is the executive director of Torah Trumps Hate, and as one of the most outspoken members of the Orthodox community, he frequently speaks out about their support of Trump. He also quickly became enmeshed in the group, which is an organization of Torah-affiliated Jews who are committed towards educating, empowering, and mobilizing themselves regarding current political issues such as civil rights, immigration, poverty, and access to healthcare. And there are many more, of course. And he was the driving force behind his move from a private group to a public one. Elad has been writing for years on his blog, Pop Chassid, and also writes for other media such as the JTA, Jewish Currents, and the Daily Dot. His work has also been previously featured in Haaretz, The Forward, Jerusalem Post, and The Guardian. Furthermore, Elad is an ordained rabbi who runs an online in-person community called Hevria, devoted to providing a home and a community for Jewish creatives. He has been named one of the Jewish Week's 36 under 36, as well as recently being named one of the fellows for the Rabbinic Entrepreneurship program at Hillel's Office of Innovation. So Elad will speak for 20 to 30 minutes, followed by a 15 to 20-minute facilitated discussion to further articulate his ideas. And after that, I will open up the floor for questions, which I will moderate. So if anyone has any questions, this is important. If you see the chat room, there is a tab that says everyone. So if you want to, message me, Uri Litzedek, with your questions as this webinar goes on, I'd be happy to ask them towards the end. So with that being said, Elad, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Danny. I am honored to be speaking with everyone. I am also a huge fan of this initiative, and feel really honored to be part of it. And I hope that there are more such things. So thank you again.
Our pleasure.
Yeah. So let's get right into it. I think, basically what I'm going to talk about is it was already summed up quite well, but I'm going to focus on a few specific things. Number one, the main thing that I want to focus on is how extremism itself, beyond just white nationalism, but how extremism is starting to infect and affect the Orthodox world, and why that's happening, what set the groundwork for it, and maybe we'll get to what we can do about it. But at the very least, I want to address the very many different dynamics that come into play there. Danny, do you mind muting yourself just to be?
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. So I think it's important before we start to lay out a few things. Number one, the thing that I've noticed the most in this discussion is that there seems to be even people that are aware that there's a problem of growing extremism and racism and white nationalism in the Orthodox world tend to think of it as particularist. They tend to think of it as focused specifically on the Orthodox world because of the Orthodox world's unique problems and these sorts of things. I think that's actually a lot more complicated than that. I think that what we're really talking about is a confluence of two things. One is the unique nature of the Orthodox world. The other is the fact that the Orthodox world is in many ways, because it's become, and I'm speaking very broadly here, I just should set that as a disclaimer. Of course, I'm part of Torah Trump State, so I know and very much believe that there is a strong contingent of Orthodox Jews who are not going through this, who are not part of the right and these sorts of things, don't support Trump, etc. But I'm talking about kind of overall dynamics and how, in general, when we talk about extremism, we're not necessarily saying that everyone in a community is going through it, but enough that we need to take note of it. So just laying that out there. So there are kind of two different dynamics that I think are happening. One is that the Orthodox world has some unique traits to it that make it more susceptible to extremism and make it more susceptible to extremism on the right specifically. And I think there's another thing going on, which is that the Orthodox world is and I would argue this is very specific maybe to certain sects within Orthodoxy, especially any that are very largely aligned with the right-wing world, as opposed to let's say, there's a lot of modern Orthodox communities that tend to verge on centrism and a little bit, kind of a more mainstream, old school right-wing philosophy, for example. And I'm not really describing those. I'm kind of describing more of the ones that have for years become more and more attached to the right in America in a lot of different ways, in terms of their media consumption when it comes to politics, in terms of their mistrust of different things like the media, etc. So when I'm describing all those things, what I'm really describing, in my opinion, is actually something that I don't think is spoken about so much, which is what I call right-wing assimilation. We tend to, the Jewish world has a lot of tropes and a lot of, and I'm talking the entire Jewish world, or at least that diaspora, and especially in America, we have a lot of tropes about how Judaism works and what it means to be assimilated and that sort of thing. And one of the things we have to take into account here is that assimilation doesn't just, is not just about liberal values infecting, our pure religion. Assimilation is really just about attaching yourself to a culture. And ultimately that's impossible to avoid to a certain extent, as much as, for example, Haredi communities are in theory built to protect themselves from this. The irony of that has been that because there has been such a concern about the infection of liberalism into these communities, and there have been a lot of protective measures to avoid that, there hasn't been really much of a protective measure when it comes to right-wing culture, which in America, really what we're starting to see now, it used to be a more monolithic culture, right? There used to be, a few channels on television, and there used to be, for the most part, run by, people with similar views and similar biases, and there were advantages to that, and there were definitely disadvantages to that. But one of the things that we're seeing now is a fracturing of our culture. It's not just about right and left, but right and left is kind of the, at least in this discussion, is the most obvious one to focus on, where we're starting to have two Americas. And what I mean by that is not like a metaphor. What I mean by that is a very literal experience that America is going through right now. And I think it's to a certain extent been discussed ad nauseum, and also discussed, I would say, very simplistically by commentators and these sorts of things. I work in social media marketing. I work in marketing in general, online marketing, these sorts of things. So this is something I've ironically had experience with from that angle more than anything. And I think the thing that defines the internet era more than anything is fracture. And I'm not necessarily saying that as a negative thing. For example, Torah Trump's hate is a great example of how fracturing can be an incredibly moral thing, in my opinion. When a group of Orthodox Jews feel alone, anyone that knows the story, I assume that the people here, from what I see of the participants, know the story of Torah Trump's hate, which was a bunch of Orthodox Jews felt really alone. And it was actually, when I look back on it, it actually kind of amazes me. Because there was about a year, I would say, when Orthodox Jewry seemed to be, at least in terms of people's personal experiences, in terms of their connections, in terms of media awareness, these sorts of things, Orthodox Jewry seemed to be this thing that was dominated by only one perspective when it came to politics. That was all I was seeing personally, and I felt very alone. And all of a sudden, someone told me about this group, Facebook group, Torah Trump's hate. At the time, I had a few hundred members, and a year later, had over 1,000 or maybe even more than that. And then next thing we knew, we were an activist organization. Next thing we knew, people don't, in general, talk about the ones that are at least more literate when it comes to the differences between Jewish groups are kind of more aware that there is a liberal wing to the Orthodox world, progressive wing, I should say, politically progressively, and that's a huge thing. That's not something that I think would have been accomplished without the internet. But there's another thing that's going on with the internet, which is that Torah Trump's hate is a good example in the sense that we've created a bit of a bubble for ourselves in good and bad ways, where we have, and anyone who's been in a Facebook group that's very active knows how this is. And anyone that has a news feed knows what this is like. Anyone that's been on Twitter knows what this is like. No matter what, it's almost impossible. And I would say it actually is impossible to break outside of whatever bubble we inhabit. We can take efforts to do so. We can try and mitigate the factors of it. But at the end of the day, it's going to be very hard to truly have a holistic view of the world. There's always going to be a certain limit that we have. And so the reason that I'm bringing all this up is because this split in America has created a world in which you can have, I think something that was not foreseen by, past commentators about totalitarianism and authoritarianism and fascism was that they tended to assume that these movements could only happen with the buy-in of the majority of the country, or a buy-in of enough of the country to flip things around. Now, I would say what we've seen in America, what we've seen in other countries as well, has been that what you need is a vocal minority of people to help create a movement that grows enough that it becomes mainstream, and that it encompasses people's lives enough that that group of people can totally buy into, let's say, white nationalist, fascist, authoritarianism, just to pick a random example. And that's what's happening on the right in general. This is a dynamic that we're seeing, and where many of us who know, unfortunately in the Orthodox world, many of us already have experience with this dynamic where you'll talk to someone about a fact that you learned, from reading the news or something like that, and it will be straight up denied for a lot of reasons. Maybe Trump tweeted it out, and it became, and generally when Trump tweets out an idea, it becomes mainstream ideology at a certain point. Or maybe it was spread on Fox News, or maybe there's a bunch of different reasons. But the point being that what's been created on the right, in my opinion, means the mainstream right is a lot of what we've seen in authoritarian and fascist governments, where facts are distorted, or facts are used to fit an agenda, to the point where essentially they're living in an alternate reality. And I don't mean to put them down. It's actually quite the opposite. What I'm trying to say is that this is a concerted effort. From what we've seen, there's enough evidence right now to show that there's a concerted effort when it comes to the government, when it comes to the Trump administration, when it comes to Republicans, when it comes to Fox News, and then a bunch of other dynamics. So all of this to say that this dynamic has been happening on the right. So, and because the left, because that has been occurring, and because Orthodox Jewry in many ways is enmeshed, at least when we talk on the political side of things, is enmeshed in the right's political media and the political ideologies and the political messaging, they start to take those things in. And what's happening on the right, and I've been kind of speaking very obliquely about fascism and these sorts of things, but I want to be a little bit more specific about what's going on the right that has been kind of starting to seep into the Orthodox world. And then I want to explain a few reasons that the Orthodox world in particular is even more susceptible maybe than someone who grew up, let's say, in a classic Republican household, with old school Republican views. So first of all, what we have is I think one of the things that we cannot discount, and we actually have to really think about quite a lot, and this was mentioned by Danny when he introduced me, is white nationalism is a movement that is not given the credit that it deserves in terms of how well it's done in mainstreaming its ideology. Now, white nationalism is a very broad term, so I'm going to kind of try to describe a few more specifics. There are organizers online, and by the way, white nationalism itself is maybe not even the right word for this. Alt-right is maybe an example of it. It really depends on how deep you want to go in terms of extremism and describing it. But at the end of the day, what's happening is that there are a large group of extremists in different places, whether it's incels or white nationalists or alt-right, but I'm going to focus on white nationalists, that have learned how to manipulate the internet. And it's actually something that they did it even before the internet, but became much more effective when the internet came around. What they've done essentially has been a combination of things. The main thing that they've done is weaponized trolling. And what I mean by that is that trolling used to be this, we used to think of trolling, most people tend to think of trolling as something where all you're trying to do is upset someone. You're trying to hurt them, upset them, get them angry. And once that's been accomplished, then you're a troll. Trolling has evolved. Trolling is a skill, is a skill set, and it's something that Trump, for example, uses quite well. And I would argue that he most likely learned it both in his personal life. He seems to be a natural troll, but also as someone who is connected in many ways to the more extremist side of the right wing. So here's how trolling works when it comes, if you're a white nationalist. What you do is you say something extremely offensive, Maybe you're using a fake account, or maybe you're using your own account. Maybe you've gained enough followers. Milo used to do this all the time. Say something incredibly disgusting and offensive and upsetting, and with a tinge of humor and maybe irony. And what ends up happening, this is kind of like memes are built around this idea. And what ends up happening, we've seen Trump do this. Trump does it. A good example of Trump doing this has been, his. If you follow him on Twitter, you might have seen him do like himself as Thanos, and it seems like this ridiculous thing. But also, if you are on the left and you know enough about authoritarianism, it's actually very scary, because you think, wow, this guy is spreading an overtly genocidal and authoritarian message. But what ends up happening, if you look at the reactions, there's a few different reactions that occur. And this occurs in general with these trolling things. But I think Trump is maybe the easiest example. What ends up happening is there's a combination of reactions. The people who are theoretically targeted by the trolling, get enraged or fearful. And either way, social media creates incentives that encourage people to react. We on social media, what we're trained to do, we are machines relative to the machines. We are built to react quickly and emotionally when we see something that sparks something within us, an emotion. It could be joy, but it's actually, there's been multiple studies done that anger is the most effective way to get people to react to something online. Now, on social media, a reaction is better termed as engagement. And anyone who works in marketing online knows that engagement has this kind of inherently positive connotation when you're talking about social media. The only reason it has that inherently positive connotation is because it allows you to achieve your goals. So, what's happening? People get enraged. They spread these stories that they're very angry about or very scared about. And at the same time, the moderates, the people who are not concerned or who have bought into Trump or white nationalism on a kind of moderate level, or see it even not as a threat at all, and actually see, or they are just taking joy in the fact that the other side is hurting and scared, tend to look at it as a joke. I would say those descriptions of the people that are on the receiving end of trolling encompass maybe 98 to 99% of the responses to trolling. There happens to be a 1%, and this is why the anger is so essential to trolling, because it helps spread these trolls and their messages. There's the 1% that are moved by the message, who take it seriously in some way. This is one of the ways white nationalists recruit. Kind of over time, enraging people, but also bringing in the 1% that are attracted to them, bringing them in. Maybe it's even lower than that, but they get enough in that soon they start to build up the ideology, and soon there's enough people taking these trolls very seriously. If you also look at the reactions to Trump's trolling, you will see a large amount of people who say, QAnon's a good example, people who are like, what is the message here that he's sending us? And what do we have to do? And very often it actually very much aligns with the fears of people on the left. So why am I saying that? This is something that unfortunately the Orthodox world happens to be caught up in as well. Anyone, especially, it's very interesting. There's kind of there's varying groups in the Orthodox world that are, getting these memes, these news pieces, these images, these trolls, these different things that are on the receiving end of a lot of these things. And what ends up occurring is that very often the same dynamic occurs, because the ones who are active on social media are for sure susceptible to this, very susceptible. The ones who are purely use WhatsApp are also susceptible to this, maybe even in an even worse way, because they're kind of much more siloed than someone on Facebook would be, and they can build up like extremist sects within these kind of walls of WhatsApp. And then these things start to spread in the way that anything on the internet starts to spread. It doesn't just occur online. It starts to get spread beyond the borders of the internet, in shul and different places, gathering places. And we start to hear, anyone that is, I assume the people listening or watching are aware that have heard disturbing things from the from the Orthodox world. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is that there's a very concerted campaign to make people more extremist. It's not just an unintentional side effect of having an authoritarian leader. It's actually a very specific, coordinated thing that has been occurring among a lot of extremist groups, because they know that they can be effective with that. And then what you have is mainstream leaders like Trump using those same tactics. And actually, if you look specifically, I forget the name, Trump War Room is one of the Twitter accounts of the Trump social media team, and they are very clearly influenced by the alt-right and white nationalist tactics. So that's one example. I'm sorry that one example took so long, but that's like a very important one that I feel is not being spoken about enough. I happen to have just written an article about it, be coming out the Daily Dot soon, so that's part of why I'm sharing it with you, because I think it's very important. I'm trying to kind of describe the mechanics of extremism, because I think it's especially in the new age, I think that we need to have a grasp of what's occurring around us. Another thing that is occurring is that, and we see this all the time on any conservative outlet, that they take one idea at a time. For example, xenophobia, anger at illegal immigrants, these sorts of things. And the Orthodox world happens to be very susceptible to this for a lot of reasons. One is that they, because I think there's a very distinct view that non-Orthodox Jews aren't aware of, and I think liberal Orthodox Jews might not be aware of as well, which is that Orthodox Jews and Orthodox Jewry, especially Haredi Jewry, especially Hasidic Jewry, are very much less excited about democracy and about kind of a diverse world and these sorts of things. They're particularist, if you want to put it that way. And so, for example, things like philo-Semitism are not seen as dangerous. Love of Jews is not seen as dangerous, which is a whole discussion in of itself. But basically, the ideology fits with a view in which there is a caste of people, where some people are at the top and some people are at the bottom, and it's determined by the group or the tribe or the religion that you happen to belong to. And they believe, honestly, that the Jewry deserves to be at the top. And so what's happening is that there is this very interesting thing occurring where ideas that at their core are anti-Semitic, because they assume that there is a invisible hand kind of operating behind the scenes, often viewed as like the octopus, these sorts of images, which is these are the Jews who are the ones who are actually making all this stuff happen. But the surface of, I don't know, surface, but one of the idea is that the Jews are animating all the problems that are occurring around. So an Orthodox Jew is hearing things like, an invasion of immigrants, shithole countries, all these things that are first originated on white nationalist websites and made their way to Fox News and then made their way to Donald Trump's mouth. What that creates is a situation in which one idea starts to get mainstream, then another, and then another, and then another, and then soon what you have is a rising level of bigotry and extremism that is starting to become not just on the sidelines, not just with extremists, but mainstream. And what that does is that also creates a situation in which extremists themselves are more empowered, as we've seen with mass shootings and that sort of thing. Sorry, I hope, am I going too quickly, too slowly? We doing okay? Yeah? All right. If anyone has any notes, feel free to interrupt me. There's another thing going on, which is that I want to just focus one more time on, I'll talk a little bit more about authoritarianism and how that's affected the Orthodox world, and then let's speak a little bit more to the specifics of Orthodox Jewry. So I think one of the things that, again, is misunderstood, I think maybe I misunderstood this because I'm Baal Tshuva, I became Orthodox later in life. I always assumed that all Jews were kind of on the same page when it came to being against authoritarianism. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of Orthodox cultures and communities are at least indirectly or directly connected to authoritarian ideology. That can mean things like believing in a rebbe, the power of a rebbe. It opens people up to these sorts of concepts, for example. And it also is reflective of how these very communities were built. Besides the fact that there may be authoritarianism within the communities, there's also another thing going on, which is how they relate to the outside world, which is years and years of authoritarianism being imposed upon them in their communities, and them essentially building communities made to deal with authoritarianism. So what I mean by that is that when a person like Trump comes around, that's not something that's necessarily seen as inherently evil, just because he sounds like a dictator. They might themselves be aware. Very often we kind of assume that people aren't aware that someone is trying to be a dictator. I think that might be less true in the Orthodox world. I think that there is an openness to benevolent authoritarians. And I think that part of what's occurring in the Haredi world, for sure, I think, this is specific, I think, to the Haredi world, and especially to the Hasidic world. In communities that are built, like came from Eastern Europe, these sorts of things. They've essentially been built to adapt to worse and better conditions, with the idea that as long as they remain intact, remain together, and protect themselves, and in whatever way possible, that they will survive. So that means, for example, in an openly democratic society, that they have to cut out all those influences. On the other hand, when it comes to a particularist authoritarian society, it means either working with the authoritarian or protecting yourself from that. In this case, I think they feel like I'm speaking very generally, so I don't mean to apply this to every Orthodox Jew. But I think that I'm talking about cultural dynamics. I think that there is an openness to authoritarianism, especially when it sounds like it's going to work in their direction. And we've seen this, I think, applied in Russian Jewish communities. Russian Chabad, for example, is very, Putin has a very benevolent image that he creates among Russian Chabad the Russian Chabad community, I should say. And the head of the Chabad Russian community has a close relationship with him, at least when it comes to standing with him when it comes to anti-Semitism. So my point is just that we're seeing this not just in America. This is something that I think is happening more and more. So when you combine all of these things, and then you add in the fact that I've kind of not addressed the elephant in the room, which I assume that I wasn't there, unfortunately, but I assume that Manishana Shei Srishon spoke to this, is that there was already latent and overt racism, Islamophobia, and I'm not grouping this together, but I'm saying that it's connected, very strong pro-Israel views. All of these things, then, if you imagine all the things that I've just described, right? I've left out racism. I've left out, like the racism that existed before Trump. I'm leaving out, the misogyny, all these things that existed before Trump. Sorry. So I'm gonna be. I believe I have 10 minutes, but I'm actually probably not gonna be even that long. So hopefully we'll see how it goes. Thanks. So let me just close this real quick. So um, what I described was essentially the dynamics that are happening outside of the Orthodox world, and how in some ways they're open to authoritarianism, to bigotry, to all these, to xenophobia, etc., because of what's happening on the outside. But we also have to take into account the fact that, unfortunately, for a lot of different reasons, racism and xenophobia and a lot of homophobia for sure, a lot of these views were already there before Trump came into power, and I think that there's a worthy debate about whether it's gotten worse or it's just been more revealed. In my opinion, because of the dynamics that I described, I deeply believe that it's getting worse. Just as it's getting worse in the mainstream right. And again, I think there's a good argument to be made for, is the right just revealing itself more? Are people on the right just, letting out what already existed? There's a lot to talk about there with white backlash and the idea of kind of sacrificing a little bit for others, but at the end of the day, not when you start to feel like your culture is threatened, fighting back against that. That's a big discussion. What I'm simply trying to focus on is the potential for extremism, and number one, how it goes mainstream, how extreme views that were extreme 40 years ago are now mainstream for sure on the right. I don't think there's any question about that. That in and of itself allows for then the dynamics that lead to extremists, becoming violent and acting out, and not only that, feeling protected by the government when they do so, which we've of course seen, and unfortunately we've seen it apply to the Jewish world as well. One of the things that terrifies me is I kind of worry very much that we might one day see a Jewish mass shooter, like with a white nationalist ideology. I really believe and hope that it's not going to happen. I just have a fear that it might happen. And I think that if it does happen, we're going to have to deal with a huge fallout, beyond the fact that it'll just be a tragedy. So that's basically what I have to say. Unfortunately, I didn't end on such a positive note. I do think, I'll try to leave on the positive note, which is that the more we are armed with this knowledge and these ideas, the more that we equip ourselves to understand what's happening around us, the more we are able to react to it in a better way. So for example, when you become aware that you are the tool of a troll when you spread their negative message, then you can, become more conscious of how you use social media. It's just one example. And I think, again, this education about not just the fact that it's occurring, but how it's occurring is absolutely essential, especially in the digital age, because I think it's been great that we've seen a lot of historical analogies being brought to light. I really believe in that, actually. I'm very much on board with all of that. But I think what we need is also an awareness of how the world is changing and how a lot of those historical dynamics are occurring maybe on a micro level, they're occurring in specific levels, and how social media fits into this, and the fracturing of media in general. And so I think that the more that we know, the more that we can combat it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I want to ask one or two questions before I open it up to everyone else. And what I'm really curious about is kind of how you interpret the authority of rabbis today. So kind of, I've read a significant amount of people like Thomas Friedman, who said that kind of once you took down the Berlin Wall, kind of everything flattened. And I think a lot of that also included authority and power structures, right? So if you're in an Orthodox community, in a right-wing Orthodox community, how much power do you think the rabbi has to kind of step out of line taking a different position from someone like Ben Shapiro or Dennis Prager, and kind of how effective the rabbi would be, specifically in a time of social media.
So you're saying, what power does a rabbi who holds differently have in such a scenario?
Right. Like, if people have their own information sources and can go to their news feeds and have their own kind of pundits, right, then kind of how much power can kind of a rabbi, I'd say generally us as, or at least specifically me, and as a leader in the Orthodox community, how much sway can we really have?
I mean, I can only speak to what I've seen, and for the most part, what I've seen with rabbis who have reached out to me privately, because they hold differently than the mainstream around them, is there's kind of two, I would argue there's two different groups. One is the group that has decided to remain apolitical. I think in general in Orthodoxy, we see a lot of belief that especially pulpit rabbis should not be political unless it comes to Israel, in which case that rule is thrown out the window. But I think it becomes a convenient exit strategy, because I think especially what we're seeing is a dynamic that is occurring between extremists and moderates, which is that moderates and even ones who are, like, as you're describing, who are anti what's occurring, are not necessarily feeling it as so urgent that they need to put something on the line, whether it be, just standing up in shul and saying they disagree, or whether it's, full on pushing very hard for these causes. I think in my opinion, most of the moderates and most of the people who disagree with Trump don't think it matters enough to speak up to their specific shuls. That's been my general experience, and I think there's another group who feels that it is urgent, and I think those are the people who have less to lose. I think someone who comes to mind is Yosef Rappaport. He's not necessarily like a pulpit rabbi, but he's a voice, and he's a Satmar. So I should mention the Satmar rabbi is very outspoken. His son is Alexander Rappaport, who runs a soup kitchen in New York, which is very well known, Masbia, and they're both very outspoken. I think as much as you can describe Satmars as progressive, they're very progressive in a lot of ways, and they're very outspoken, and very outspoken in their own communities as well. But these are guys who are not, they both feel a sense of urgency, but also happen to not be in a situation where they feel afraid to speak up. I don't think either of them are afraid of losing their jobs. And I think that level of fear is something to really keep in mind. Like, after I did a protest at 770, I discovered that there were a lot of young Bachrim and others who felt very sympathetic to what I was doing, but would never say anything. And so this is a little bit less about rabbis, but I think it speaks to the larger dynamic of silencing, or kind of implied, inferred silencing, where people believe that if they speak up, there will be such a reaction that they don't want to risk it, because it doesn't just mean necessarily, it doesn't just mean criticism. It might mean different forms of shunning, from outright ostracization to simply, losing friends, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think I'll open it up to questions. Since there are only 5 of us, anyone is welcome to unmute and say anything. Of course, if no one has questions, I have many more that I could ask.
Hi there.
Hi.
My name is Mitchell Levinson. I am a student at Bard College in upstate New York, and I'm just very, very happy to be here. Thank you so much, Elad, for this really interesting discussion. So yeah, I mean, what I'm thinking about is, after the Muncie attacks, there was an article written by an activist from the Muncie community, activist and a Haredi member of the Muncie community. And I'm just trying to remember his name. Shimon
something like that.
What's that? Shimon. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was Shimon Rolnitsky, and I don't know if you saw this article that came out in, I think, early January. I can also send a link if need be.
Yeah.
But he was saying that the mainstream political narrative that we were hearing in many of the larger media outlets was mischaracterizing the Haredi community of Monsey and making this a polarizing issue, as in there are Jews that are being attacked by non-white peoples, by Black people who are harboring sort of anti-Semitic ideology. And I also read your article, Elad, in Haaretz, about kind of how we don't have enough information about the levels of anti-Semitism in non-white communities in the affected areas over the course of December. But so Rolnitsky wrote out that, like, this is the problem. Actually, there are deep connections between the Monsey community and communities of color in the area, and that they're supposedly they already had like deep intercultural dialogue. And I say that, I bring that up because I sense that it challenges what you said, Elad, just about the kind of propensity in Haredi communities to harbor white nationalism, and particularly racism. I wonder how you respond.
Yeah, no, okay, so I think that's a great point, and it's part of why I added a caveat that unfortunately deserves, the caveat itself is something that deserves an entire talk, which was, I was saying that I don't think I can sum up the Orthodox world well in such a talk, but I think and there's no way that you can say that this applies. Everything that I described was general dynamics and how different things apply, and some might apply more to one community, some might apply less, some might not apply at all. But I think when it comes to the Samer community in Monsey, I actually find that to be a fascinating example. Jersey City was also really fascinating because after that we saw a rabbi get up, not a rabbi, sorry, an influential business Hasidic guy get up, Samer guy get up and quote Martin Luther King in his speech, and then also bring up the fact that immigrants are being targeted. Like, he was talking about this after the Jersey City shooting. It's amazing. So I think there's a lot of, number one, I think it gives me so much hope. But number two, I think there's two things going on. Number one, I think, when I was describing right-wing assimilation, I'm kind of fascinated by this idea and I want to examine it more. But I have this kind of ongoing theory that I keep re-examining and thinking about, which is, I largely, my personal experience has largely been with the Chabad Crown Heights community, which has also experienced a lot of these tensions and these, violent attacks in their community. And Crown Heights, Chabad, Hasidic, people tend to be more open to, in general, like mainstream right-wing talking points, just because they're more open in many ways to the world. So ironically, their openness, which we tend to associate with like kind of a liberal ideology, I actually think it makes them far more right-wing, at least when it comes to this, taking on specific talking points. Now, when it comes to the Samer community, I actually think it's much more complicated than that. For example, there was also the video that came out of the Rebbe saying, that they shouldn't buy guns, that it will lead to more innocent deaths and these sorts of things. So I'm keeping dismantling my own point, but that's purposeful because I think this points to the fact that at the end of the day, the Orthodox community is vibrant and different, and the Samer community is very special and interesting because you have I've noticed, number one, that the progressives within their movements, and he's a great example of that. He works with Joseph Rappaport, who I mentioned earlier. They speak out a lot together. Is much more outspoken, much more willing to take a stand, and much more willing to make a big difference. And I think that's largely because they've actually taken the idea of like insulating themselves much more seriously. Oh, there's another question here. It's connected to it. I feel like I can't see it for some reason. Does anyone know what it says?
See what?
There was a chat. Oh, here we go. Is Samar different because it doesn't support Israel? Aha, yes. I think that's also connected to Tova. Thank you. I think in general, all of these things are part of that story. As I mentioned, I kind of touched on pro-Israel ideology, but I think that it is connected for sure. So I think Samar is unique, but I think that we can often then get a misconception from there, which is that Satmar is completely insulated from this because we see these progressive, for example, there are not many Satmar people who would be willing to have an article spread on JTA like this. So what we're seeing is, by definition, those of us who are getting exposed to these views are getting to a certain extent a skewed perspective because we're seeing the most liberal voices speak up. So I kind of want to balance both of those. There's, on the one hand, there is this insulation from right-wing ideology. On the other hand, it still very much exists. It's still very mainstream. In some ways more mainstream than in places like Chabad. For example, the willingness to connect to authoritarianism, these sorts of things. So I think we have to kind of just balance all these things. And the more we dig into it, the more that, these complexities will keep coming out for sure. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, so it looks like we have room for, we have time for 2 more questions. So does anyone else have anything? Okay, so if that's the case, I actually have another question, which I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the kind of pro-Israel tilt to the Orthodox community. So I mean, it's interesting because I'm from Providence, Rhode Island, where the Haredi community is not big, and I've noticed that kind of over the past 10 years, it's increasingly visibly Zionist. So it used to be that during kind of Yom Ha'atzmaut, there was not often any commemoration of that, or Yom HaZikaron, right? So we'd often walk past the synagogue to go to the local JCC. But for the past few years, it's becoming increasingly pronounced. So I'm wondering kind of how much this kind of narrative of kind of Israel as a sovereign nation and a strong power, how much that's also impacted the rhetoric.
I mean, I think it definitely has. I think there's been an interesting dynamic where Israel in many ways is analogous to what's occurring in the Orthodox world, in the sense that the pro-Israel world is far more susceptible. And by that I mean, like, I'm including non-Orthodox people, are far more susceptible to the much more mainstream right-wing views that are becoming, extremist mainstream right-wing views. And so I think that there's been, in general, the Orthodox world has become more and more attached to Israel as time has gone on for a lot of different reasons. But I think what we're also seeing is kind of a reflection of the reality that as Israel itself becomes more authoritarian, more right-wing, is, I think, Orthodox Jews who consider themselves right-wing and pro-Israel are becoming more and more bought in to a world where the United States and Israel are kind of the leaders, in addition to whatever other autocracies that they happen to connect to. It's starting to realign the way that they think of the world order. I think I think there used to be a viewpoint that, Israel was weak and endangered, and these sorts of things, at least among the Orthodox world. And I think that the more that there's kind of a strong man in America and a strong man in Israel who both assert the dominance of their cultures, and then also assert the idea that the only way for them to remain dominant is to subjugate others, the more that these ideas cause a combination of, the increased authoritarian, blah, 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 all these things I described, but also an increase in connection to Israel. Because I think, when you hear Trump speak, for example, he talks about your country. When he thinks of Jews, he thinks of Israel, because to him, that's what we're defined as. And I think that to a certain extent, Orthodox Jewry, and definitely right-wing Jewry, has basically bought into that idea. And I think that that's pretty dangerous, but I think that's essentially what's happening. And I'm sure it's much more complicated than that. I'm sure Josh, who's on here, can probably speak to it a lot better than me, but that's my personal take.
Mm-hmm. All right, so last question. Who wants the honor?
Afraid I've scared everyone off.
So
if there's space, I don't want to take over someone's question, but if is it okay? Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
I just wanted to sort of bring in another on the ground perspective again. I was in Russia, in St. Petersburg, for 4 months last year, and connected with the Chabad community. And I just wanted to get sort of maybe an elaboration of what you think is happening in Russian Chabad communities, being representative of the space in certain Orthodox communities to connect and admire authoritarians. I mean, is there something you think in the culture, or is it something coming textually? What do you think about that?
I mean, I actually think it's largely utilitarian. Like, I think that what you see is not, I don't think, there's kind of two groups. One is the group that, genuinely kind of worships or at least admires the strong man. And then there's the group, and then I'd say there's, this is a degree thing, not a black or white thing. And then there's the group, especially I would argue this is very true of communal leaders with a lot of power within their communities, who see the simultaneous opportunity and danger of authoritarians. I think, again, this is the thing that has been ingrained in many ways in these communities, is an awareness that an authoritarian presents two alternate worlds. One is the world where you're subjugated, and another world you're the special class. Those are the two options. And so their job as leaders is to make sure, and it's very interesting because I actually sympathize with it. I wonder what I would do if I was in a place like Russia or something like that. Like, what would I do if I was the head of the Chabad Russian community and Putin was reaching out to me and I needed to compromise on my values to make sure that my community was safe? As far as I can make out, according to halacha and the Jewish ideology, I would probably have to, in some level, be open to it. And I think that it's hard to know what's going on in their heads. I think it's quite possible that every Chabad rabbi is open into Putin as an authoritarian. But I think really what's occurring is that there's just a simultaneous dynamic of an awareness that Russia has been anti-Semitic for so long. They happen to be, and they're still anti-Semitic. Of course, I'm not trying to erase that. And I think, if anything, they're simply trying, it's more factional than anything, they're trying to protect their communities locally. And whether that affects Jews at large, I don't think they're necessarily even that concerned with it. I think that would be ideal for them. But I think what we're seeing is more of a self-interested tribal interest and concern for their community specifically, if that makes sense, and the safety of their community. Mm-hmm. Kind of a more urgent question, at least in their minds, I would say.
All right, so I wanted to thank everyone for turning in, and especially thanking Elad for presenting and for taking the time to do this. The webinar series will continue next month on March 16th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time with Rabbi Yonasan Perry, a Chabad rabbi based in Los Angeles, who will be giving a lesson titled Disciples of Aaron, Addressing Racism Through a Lens of Halakha and Jewish Tradition. And if you have not done so already, please take the anti-racism pledge and check out our resource page on our website at www.utzedek.org. That is spelled UTZEDEK.org. So thank you for listening, and I hope everyone has a good night. So bye.
Thank you.
So much.